Is this your phone? You might want that. Thanks for having us today. We really appreciate it. We have friends that live in Toledo, and he's the pastor of the Foursquare Church in Waldport. And I've known Seth actually I worked with him we were on staff at the same mega church, and I was his direct report. And then he moved to the coast, and we just love Seth and Holly, and Holly is employed here in Toledo at a hair salon. And anyway, they're just great people. And I've been helping Seth out in Waldport for 10 years. So like once a quarter, I'd give him some relief in the pulpit. And so I've been helping him out at Waldport, like I said, for the past 10 years or so. And they laugh at my jokes. So it's a win-win. And in fact, I was just speaking there last week because Seth was blessing the fleet in Newport last Sunday. So anyway, and my wife, you met Sean. We've had a really rich, adventuresome life. And Debbie asked what my favorite food was. I was stumped because eating is like my spiritual gift. And I was praying about what to say today, and I just thought maybe a good word for a church in transition, such as yourselves, would be a message on commitment. Because last time I checked, Jesus is still the head of the church, right? So, and I can empathize. We want to pray for Pastor Charles and Debbie, and as they transition to Arizona. But and by the way, I notice everything in Arizona, the flora and the fauna both want to kill you. So just keep that in mind. But long story short, Jesus is the head of the church, and so he's going to provide for your needs, in this transition period and long term as well. It's his job, really, to provide the right pastor. It's nothing that we need to stress about. We pray about it, certainly, but we don't have to stress about it because the church, it's Jesus' problem. And it's not one that we have to solve. It's one that we need to pray about. So anyway, long story short, back in the day, I was a whitewater raft guide. And a buddy of mine owned the company. He's a member of the church I was pastoring. And so he said, "Hey, Greg, you love whitewater rafting so much. Why don't you become a guide?" So I went to guide training school, and I was a celebrity guide. Weekend warrior. I did Fridays and Saturdays because I was still pastoring on Sundays. And it was a great experience. But during guide training school, I became a swiftwater rescue technician. But during guide training school, they told us a story about Russ. Russ was a guide from New Zealand, so he could guide in Northern California during the summer, and then during the winter in California, he'd go back to New Zealand where it's summer there, so he could guide kind of year-round. But Russ, on one occasion, they had told us on the upper stretch of the South Fork of the American River, where we were, was one of the rivers we guided, but the third rapid in is a rapid called Maya. And we were told, whatever you do not ever hit the big wave in Maya, because it will flip your boat, then your guests will have an out-of-boat experience. It won't be pleasant, and so avoid the big wave at Maya. So I made a mental note of that. But Russ, apparently, for whatever reason, he did not avoid the big wave. And sure enough, he hit it, and his boat flipped. And everybody went for a swim. It's not a huge river. It's like a little bit like the Deschutes in Central Oregon. But so everybody made it to shore, but the raft was stuck. It was upside down, and it was surfing that reverse curl in the rapid. And so the raft is out there. And so he threw his throw bag out to try to get that. Didn't do anything. So he actually hiked a bit upstream, hailed down another raft, and the guy picked him up and took him out to the middle of the river. And Russ jumped in, and he swam toward the raft. And he came up underneath, and he said he was holding onto the cross thwart. And he said that the hydraulics were so turbulent, he could barely hang on. And so he's trying to get the raft out, and he couldn't. And then the hydraulics had the effect of they ripped off his swimming trunks. And they were downstream, never to be seen again. And so he wasn't having any success releasing the boat, so he got out and went to swim to shore, and then he realized, I've still got guests on shore. And so at least he was a quick thinker, so he took off his life jacket. Now, in guide land, The smaller your life jacket, the more macho you are. And his was pretty small. But he was creative, and he fashioned it into kind of like a diaper. And so so finally the river surged a little bit. The raft got loose, and he got it back, and everybody got back in the boat. But there are no roads at this part of the river, and the next stop is like 8 miles down. He had to guide the rest of the trip wearing this his life vest as a diaper. So I made a strong mental note: avoid the big rapid at Maya. But I thought, how embarrassing would that be? And then I started thinking, well, I wonder if God ever has embarrassing moments. I made lots of blunders and mistakes in my life, but the show America's Funniest Home Videos, I wonder if God ever has some of those corresponding experiences. And if he does, I would submit it's probably what I would call flaky Christians. People who talk the talk, but don't walk the walk. And I've talked to waitresses, for example, who dread the church crowd on Sundays after church. Because typically, they say, when I see people praying at a table, I assume they're going to be pushy and demanding and leave a terrible tip. I thought, what kind of a witness is that? Or how about dishonest Christian businessmen? Or, pastors or church leaders who have fallen due to sexual immorality. People who go by the name of Christ, but do not positively reflect his character. The German philosopher Nietzsche put it this way: if you Christians would have me believe in your Redeemer, you'll have to act more redeemed. And so I want to address the topic of commitment. I keep hearing some scraping noise. Do you hear it? Maybe it's, well, anyway, hopefully that will be better. Anyway, we'll see. So I want to talk about commitment. And for some, that C word is more scary than the word cancer. So we're going to talk about that today. But see, if we are people of faith, then by definition we are to be faithful. And so that, however, flies in the face of some cultural values that we have in our society. A couple of cultural myths about commitment. First of all, the most common attitude about commitment is this: I'm committed until I'm no longer committed. In other words, yeah, I'm committed, but when the going gets tough or circumstances change and I don't feel like it, then I can bag on my commitments. When I served before I graduated from Bible college as an ambulance driver for a bit, and we had to answer every call that came to our station. Would be out the door within 3 minutes and on the scene in another 9 minutes. And if we weren't there within 12 minutes, we had to give an account why. See, and not even 9 out of 10 was good enough. It had to be 100% commitment. Nothing else would do. And as I mentioned, if we're people of faith, then we are called to be faithful. It's definitional to the term. And if you think about it, the phrase, I'm committed until I'm no longer committed, that is an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. Some of my other favorite oxymorons are jumbo shrimp, government efficiency, temporary tax increase, military intelligence, and Microsoft Works. See, I'm committed until I'm no longer commitment. What kind of commitment is that? And a second cultural value when it comes to commitment is this: commitment is a trap. So at my wedding, I was so nervous that to this day, I don't remember the actual ceremony. Now, I didn't pass out, but I kind of blanked out. And the only parts of my wedding that I can recall are my best man whispered in my ear, "With this wing I thee read." He's trying to get me to mess up. And then the minister saying, "Will you take Sean to be your wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward?" And I actually had to say, "Huh?" I mean, I was out of it, so I had to repeat it. I was so nervous at my wedding. And maybe, it's because I'd seen too many I Love Lucy reruns or something like that, but I was expecting, mud packs and hair curlers and, But see, I thought marriage was a trap. My freedom was going to be lost forever. I knew that marriage was about unconditional commitment, but I just felt like, and I couldn't live without her, so I made the choice. I would rather spend the rest of my life in the prison of marriage. But Now, I can tell you on the other side of marriage that commitment is actually liberating, so long as you make the right kinds of commitments. I made an unconditional commitment that day, and so did my wife. And I have discovered that unconditional commitment sets you free from the bondage of the performance mentality. The performance mentality is, if I don't measure up, I'm going to be rejected. That's the performance mentality. And, if I don't perform to a certain standard, unconditional commitment provides a security for trust and intimacy to develop. It's really foundational to that. That's why our culture misses so much. But here's the key concept. Our lives are shaped by our commitments. In fact, I would suggest that commitment is maybe the most essential component to a healthy relationship, including our relationship with God. And so today I want to take a look at 3 guys in the Old Testament who demonstrate that kind of commitment to God. About 600 years before Jesus was born, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon besieged Jerusalem. He took the city captive, and he took away many of Israel's finest citizens. Now, Babylon was an ancient city in Mesopotamia. Its ruins lie about 55 miles south of Baghdad on the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq. Now, among those deported to Babylon were 4 young men from the tribe of Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And in captivity, they were given new names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azariah was called Abednego. I saw one sign that said, Shadrach, Meshach, and a bean to go. Coffee roasters. And VeggieTales, if you remember them back in the day, called them Rack, Shack, and Benny. But these 4 Hebrews excelled in wisdom and knowledge and found favor in King Nebuchadnezzar's eyes. The king put them into service as among his most trusted and wise men and counselors. And when Daniel proved to be the only person capable of interpreting one of Nebuchadnezzar's troubling dreams, the king placed him in one of the highest positions over the whole province of Babylon, including the wise men of the land. And at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as administrators under Daniel. And then the king got this notion, maybe from being corrupted by power or whatever, to erect a huge golden image and commanded all the people to bow down and worship it whenever they heard the sound of the trumpet. Now, this statue, this golden image, was 90 feet tall. That's like 3 telephone poles tall. And it was 9 feet wide. And anyone who failed to bow down and worship the image would be thrown into an immense blazing furnace, a huge chamber that was used to smelt minerals or bake bricks for construction. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were committed to worship the one true God. And so eventually they were reported to the king. They courageously stood before him as the king pressured them to deny their God. And this is what Daniel 3, verses 16 through 18 says. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have placed up. So, here's an important safety tip. That is not what you want to say to a king. Kings are used to having their own way, and they don't like it when their will gets crossed like that. And so when filled with pride and rage, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than normal. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were bound and cast into the flames. And the furnace was so hot, it actually killed the soldiers who had escorted them. Daniel 3, verses 24 and 25. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Well, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." That's an amazing verse right there. Theologians speculate that 4th person in the fire could have been an angel, or quite possibly what's called a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. How cool is that, if that's the case? Not only did God save them from the furnace, but he was actually with them in the fire and in the flames, in their ordeal, Perhaps you've heard the Hillsong United song called "There Was Another in the Fire." That's what it's talking about. It's God's promise to be with us when we're in the flames. And then the king called the men to come out of the furnace, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked out with not even a hair of their head singed. They didn't smell like smoke. They didn't smell like s'mores. It was like they'd never been in the furnace at all. And Nebuchadnezzar was dumbfounded. He was flabbergasted, without explanation. So Daniel 3:28 picks up and says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar said, 'Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God.'" And so through God's miraculous deliverance of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that day, the rest of the Israelites in captivity were given freedom to worship God. And in addition to that, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were given a promotion. Now, that is a classic. That's a great story to illustrate what we're talking about today, the topic of commitment. So let's define our terms about what commitment is. Commitment is the resolve to stay with a decision long after the emotion in which the decision is made or is gone. The emotion is gone, but we stay with the decision. So it means to resolve to make up our minds, to predetermine that this is what I'm going to do no matter what. And see, so many times our decisions are based on emotions. But this commitment was based not on just emotions, because that's not going to last. Emotions come and go. Have you noticed that? Feelings are here one day and gone the next, but commitment says the feelings may be gone, but the commitment is solid. Now, would you agree that commitment is a quality that is in short supply these days in our culture? Researcher George Barna noted that where we once valued commitment, we now value flexibility. I can't commit because I need to keep my options open. I can't commit because I need to remain flexible. I can't commit because I don't want to be tied down. Or I don't want to commit because a better option might come along. Now, what happens, though, when you choose to be a person of commitment? Well, first of all, you will be noticed. Make no mistake about that. Show me a person of commitment, and I'll show you a person who stands out. Daniel 3:12. "But there are some Jews whom you set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." So their actions made the other people offended, and they got reported as a result. So secondly, not only you'll be noticed, you'll be targeted. Daniel 3:13. "Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and so these men were brought before the king." See, people with little or no commitment like to bring others down to their level. You could become the object of ridicule, sarcasm, and in this case, the king's anger. And so, thirdly, you'll be questioned. Not everything is hunky-dory when you make that kind of a commitment. Daniel 3:14, "And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Is it true that you're a follower of Jesus now? Is it true that you go to church? Who do you think you are? Do you think you're better than us?' Not everybody's going to be really ecstatic with that decision, that commitment. And then number 4, you will be tested. Daniel 3:15, "If you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Come on, everybody else is doing it. What difference will it make if you just do it this one time? And so when you become a person of commitment, especially a commitment to God, those are some of the consequences of that commitment. And so you're going to have to ask yourself this question: am I going to compromise, or am I going to confirm my commitment? Now, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were at a major cross point in their lives. And you don't see it, but you have to wonder and speculate. Maybe did they ever experience a little bit of doubt about their commitment? What difference will it make if we just bow down this one time? Aren't we better off to serve God alive than dead? I have the capacity to think that. If it would have been me, I would have, pretended to trip and fall, and that way bow down to it. Or maybe, choose that moment to tie up my shoestrings or something and pretend like I was bowing down or something, I mean, I have the technology to do something like that. But at the end of the day, I respect and admire the commitment that these guys had. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were able to hold true to their commitment for a couple of reasons. And first of all, they believed that God was able. Daniel 3:17. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. So the God I serve is able. He's able to help me with that difficult conversation. He is able to help solve this financial situation. He's able to help me with this relationship. I love Ephesians 3:20. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or even imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. God has unlimited resources at his disposal. Great commitments are not built on what I can do. They're built on what God can do. Number 2, they were predetermined to do the right thing regardless of the consequences. So here's a question. Does God promise to come through in every crisis situation and rescue us from harm? No, not so much. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were determined to be faithful without any guarantee of deliverance. I mean, I love this verse, Daniel 3:18. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Even if God doesn't rescue them, they're not going to bow down. And so, see, their commitment was to God. It wasn't to an outcome. That's a huge difference. If we truly believe God is able to save regardless of the circumstances, and we truly believe in the right thing regardless of the consequences, guess what? We're not going to waver in our commitments. So, how do I become a person of commitment? First of all, commitment starts with the little things. Commitment in the small things is foundation to commitment in the greater things. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made the decision not to defile themselves with the king's royal food long before they made this commitment not to serve and bow down this golden image. And so unless we're able to make commitments in little things, we're not going to be prepared to make commitments for larger issues. And all along the way, holding true to those smaller commitments, you're building a foundation of character that gives you strong commitment. Well, secondly, commitments are made inwardly before they're ever revealed outwardly. In other words, they begin in the heart. They're internal. Daniel 3:16. O king, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. Before we came here today, in your presence, king, we knew what we were going to do. Our minds have been made up. The decision has been made. There is no room for discussion or no negotiation. There's no need for debate. And then next, commitment is lived day by day. See, commitment doesn't have anything to do with talent or abilities. It has everything to do with choice. And it's one thing to talk about commitment, but it's another thing to live it out day by day. The only real measure of commitment is action. Nothing is easier to say words of commitment. Nothing is harder than living them day by day. In other words, commitment's not just a one-time decision. It's day by day, moment by moment. I heard the story of one lady who was appearing before in a divorce court, and she said, Your Honor, I took him for better, for worse, but he's much worser than I took him for. And I heard of another guy that, at his wedding, he was asked, do you promise to take her for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer? And he said, yes, no, yes, no. He thought it was multiple choice or something. So how do you do with your commitments? How do you follow? Are you good at following through on your commitments? Because it's all about action. That's the demonstration of them. Commitment opens the doors to God's best, though. That's the good side of commitment. I mean, I see so many people that miss God's best because they quit too soon, threw in the towel too early, and gave up too easily. Daniel 3, verse 29. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who says anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be cut to pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Commitment has its reward at the end of the day. And then commitment, here's the final one. Commitment reveals deep trust in God. Commitment says, basically, God, I'm trusting you in this situation. And it works in a couple of ways. Commitment is revealed when I'm in a potentially compromising situation. Now, did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trust God? Well, absolutely, without a doubt. No one can question their commitment. Daniel 3:28, they trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than to serve or worship any god except their own. They were definitely in a potentially compromising situation. And as a pastor, I've been asked by people on different occasions, facing a big decision. And sometimes my response is, well, how big is your God? Well, I'm going to get even with that person if it's the last thing I do. Well, how big is your God? Do you not think he's able to handle this situation? Or I have to be dishonest at work or I'm not going to make it financially. Well, how big is your God? I have to compromise my values with him, or he said he'd dump me. How big is your God? I can't afford to tithe. We already can't make ends meet. How big is God? See, commitment is revealed when I'm in a potentially rewarding situation as well. And I see how many times people miss something great simply because they weren't willing to take that step of commitment. They're held back by their past failures or their fears. They're held back by their own limiting beliefs. They're held back by their lack of faith in God. If you want to be a person of commitment, it starts by trusting God and making commitments that stretch you and cause you to put your faith in someone who's bigger than you. And see, this is what I like about God. When we take a step demonstrating faith, God moves with us. I look back on my marriage. I'm so glad, though, even though I was terrified and scared to death, that I made that commitment. Because looking back, I think of marriage is the second biggest blessing of God in my life, next to salvation in Jesus. I've been so blessed in my marriage. And I would have missed all that blessing, if I had let my fear overcome the commitment I need to make. And so I'm grateful to God I was able to do that. That's how God works, though. Sometimes we have to get in positions where we got to trust him. We might not even have an option. But guess what? He blesses as a result of that. When the Israelites were crossing the Jordan River to get to the Promised Land, they had to put their feet in the water first before the water stopped flowing. And so, there's no tiptoeing into the water because it was more like a plunge. The Jordan River was at flood stage. It was overflowing. It was deep. The water was rushing. Once you took that first step, you were pretty much committed. And so, but this is what Joshua 3:15 says. As soon as the priest who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam. Now, Adam was 19 miles upstream from where the Israelites were at. So in other words, God piled up the water there, but it would have taken some time for that water to stop flowing. And right about the time the Israelites were about ready to cross the Jordan River, guess what? That's when it stopped. But it didn't stop flowing until they actually got into the water. I hate that sometimes. If I saw, I just want the waters to part first. But sometimes you got to take that step of faith. God was working 19 miles upstream the moment the Israelites crossed over to dry ground. See, commitment is key. That until I'm committed, there's a hesitancy, a chance to draw back. But the moment I commit myself, then God moves also, and a whole stream of events erupts. All manner of unforeseen incidents, meetings, persons, material assistance, you name it. Things I could have never dreamed on my own begin to flow toward me the moment I make a commitment. In the 4th century A.D., an Asian monk by the name of Telemachus decided to make a first-time pilgrimage to the holy city of Rome. So he did. And he got to Rome, and when he got there, he noticed all the streets were filled with people, and they're all walking in the same direction. He didn't know what was going on, so he went along with the crowd, and he ended up at the Roman Colosseum. So he walked into the Colosseum with all the other crowds. Everybody sat down. And then 2 men entered the arena in the middle of the Colosseum. And they gave the customary salute. We who are about to die salute you, Caesar. And then they realized what was happening. 2 men were going to fight to the death for the entertainment of the crowd. And so he stood up from his seat and said, in the name of Christ, stop. Well, everybody was, the crowd was roaring. Nobody could hear him. So he went down to the front, close to where the arena was. And he said it again, in the name of Christ, stop. Well, again, that didn't have any effect. So I actually jumped over the fence, got into the arena, and he got in between the two gladiators. And by this time, everybody had quieted down, and he said, in the name of Christ, stop. And people started to boo, and one gladiator ran his sword through him. And he knelt down, and his last words were, in the name of Christ, stop. And you could have heard a pin drop in the Roman Colosseum that day. And it began with one person. One person got up and walked out. And then a couple more people over here got up and walked out. And over here, within several minutes, the entire Roman Colosseum was emptied. And historians tell us that's the last time men ever fought to the death in the Roman Colosseum. Do not underestimate the effect that the commitment of one person who is totally sold out to Jesus can make. So I challenge us. That's a challenge to all of us. I want to be a person of my word. I want to be a person with that kind of unconditional commitment to God. Not to an outcome, but to God. Will you stand with me as we close in a moment of prayer? And if you like prayer, you can come up afterwards, and we'd be happy to pray with you over whatever it is that you'd like prayer for. But will you join me as we pray? God, I thank you so much for your word and for the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in terms of how important that we are people of our word and that our commitment to you reflects that in our daily lives. And so, God, we thank you that you're a God of grace. We don't do it perfectly all the time, but we want to be rock solid in our commitment to you. And this is the commitment that we make today. In Jesus' name, amen. And again, if you like prayer, come to the front. But otherwise, have a happy Mother's Day, and maybe you can get some vitamin D as well.